We could go through all the literature and film and plays, indeed, about sisters. But I just want to do one, which is Jane Austen. And if you just think about, Pride and Prejudice, even Persuasion, but also Mansfield Park and Sense and Sensibility. And just think about those novels. You think that maybe Pride and Prejudice is a novel about a number of young women who are going to be married and the different ways in which they will find husbands. You could think about Mansfield Park as this young woman, Fanny Price, who's almost orphaned, who goes into this other household and eventually finds love after a lot of misadventures. And you could think about Persuasion as an idea of sort of love in autumn, how love happens. And then I think for 100 years almost, that is how people read those novels. But over the last while, people have been looking at those books and realizing, where does the father go in Mansfield Park when he disappears? He's away for a while. It's crucial he's away. He goes to the West Indies. He owns a sugar plantation. Meaning, hold on, this is a novel about a house that is run on slavery. This is a slave owner. Fanny Price moves into a house, her uncle is a slave owner. And that just gives you a whole new way of reading the book, as in, with Persuasion, Jane Austen's Persuasion, you look at the way in which, say, the Navy is treated. Why does Jane Austen write about the Navy with such relish, with such admiration? Anyone from the Navy is good. Anyone from inherited wealth is bad. So it is as though she's exploring something in her own, I think, personal life, because her brothers were in the Navy, but also about a changing England. And then in Pride and Prejudice, there's a constant presence of the army. Lydia, she wouldn't be able to run away if the army weren't sort of moving and doing maneuvers. So you're talking about, England in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, that actually that's present. So this is actually going to lead to a question. I promise a question is coming at any moment, which is that in this novel about four sisters, it could look as though it's a novel about family, about love, about loss, about grief. But actually, all the time, there are other clocks ticking in the book. I'll come to the matter of clocks in a moment, real clocks ticking in the book. But there are other noises in the book, and the other noises, if anyone were to read it in 100 years' time, they would say, this is a novel about climate change. This is a novel about the whole idea of what food, sustainability, that these things are present in the novel as much as, personal life, as much as grief, as much as love between sisters, that those elements in the book are really striking and are really dramatic in the book. The idea of, say, food and the idea of climate, that those things are actually, they're a drum in the book almost, or they're the sort of music of the book. If the sisters are the voices, this is the orchestra that plays. Mm-hmm. And I'm presuming that this came to you almost deliberately, that these questions are ones that a novel can hold in a way, because you can make them personal. Anyway, the question, oh God, I was going to ask an actual question now. The question is how much planning, how much work, how much thought, how much did you have to leave out of that sort of large questions, even about citizens' assembly?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's so much to respond to there. Thank you so much for thinking about the book and reading the book, and thank you so much for being here. It's a lovely thing. I didn't read any of the Victorian novelists growing up. There's a longer story there in that I didn't really read fiction. I read poetry and plays, and I didn't really get around to reading novels until I was 18. And I was kind of afraid of them. I'm a very slow reader, and I found poetry and plays to be much more accessible and intimate, and they felt like a two-way transaction. There was kind of margins on the page. There was space for you to inhabit. It really felt like it needed a participant, and also that nobody else would read them if you left them on the shelf. Whereas novels, I saw them as being something more of the marketplace, or they contain their own explanations on the back. And then English novels, the ones that I was, I suppose, picking up and putting down and not reading. Including some of the ones you mentioned, I could see the women in it in pursuit of marriage, as you say. And at the time, I wouldn't have been able to read it as you've beautifully read them there as certainly being about other things. I saw them as being about propriety and this very narrow way that women could behave and move through social spaces. And I felt much more drawn to Irish novels, which were about people being miserable and trying to make the best of a bad situation and kind of just walking down the road and bumping into people. That they felt more in the world rather than in an isolated space of a house or in a kind of claustrophobic domestic realm where you have to behave a certain way and your whole social capital is how well you're able to behave according to these unwritten rules. So I'm very interested in writing about women as they are in the world. And I started this with one sister who is a geologist. And that kind of came very naturally. I grew up in Galway and spent a lot of my childhood in Connemara, which is such a rocky kind of geology to the fore landscape. And so that felt like something you could see. It wasn't an intellectual or an arbitrary way to spend your life, to be able to look at the landscape and understand how it came to be that way, and what shapes it's taken in the past, and how is it so immovable when there's so much weather falling on it. And so I wanted to write about this geologist, and then she just struck me as being a big sister. You know, she had big sister energy, and the more time I spent with her, the more I realized, well, these other women are wanting their own space in the book. And it opens with these 4 chapters of the women in their own professional lives. And in a way, that is how I think a lot of us experience being a part of a family, in that, you're mostly in your extra familial realm. You know, you don't necessarily go around thinking of yourself as a sister. You think of yourself as, as a person in their life doing what they're doing. Maybe you think of yourself as a librarian if you're a librarian, or as a chef if you're a chef. And then you happen to be part of a family. Of course, it's stamped all over you. It's probably stamped in the books that you're pushing on customers and the meals that you're making. And so I was interested in how you can't get away from the family, even if you are seeing these women in their own individual spaces.
Back to Jane Austen, one of the things that you notice in those books is how little agency the mothers have. In other words, if you think of Mansfield Park, you get Fanny Price away from her mother the minute the book starts and put her almost as an orphan, where she has to sort of invent herself, or at least make things up as she goes along. In Persuasion, Jane Austen's Persuasion, the mother is dead, and there's a sort of surrogate aunt, but there's no mother. There are sisters and no mother. And in Pride and Prejudice say that the mother is so silly that she's like a child, and the daughters are sort of adults. So I think what happens in this book is the absence of the parents give the daughters an extraordinary sort of funny power, and also it weakens them. And it makes their time together is a time almost of grief, almost of surviving. And one sister, Alwyn, becomes the mother, and becomes a mother to the others. And the way in which you pattern the book a second time in the book, early in the book, she's also a mother, a sort of stepmother figure. And but that idea of isolating them so fundamentally, that idea of just removing the parents, almost like something in a folk tale, that the parents were somehow or other magically removed in some extraordinary moment. And that I'll come to the magic moments as well in the book, but that's an element in the book of a folk tale. There were 4 sisters, and then you go, their parents, and then each one went their own way until one day they all returned. And you have that element working with some elemental idea of story, like the children of Lear almost.
Yeah, thank you. That's there. I suppose there was that, and then I don't want to spoil things for people who are partway through the book. I saw a couple of bookmarks that were in the middle, so I don't want.
and I think most people have read the book, and so you can take it out. You give the plot away.
Well, the fact that of the way that their parents died as well, there is something, almost not. I remember telling a friend who wasn't a writer, but while I was in the middle of writing the book, I think this is how their parents died. And he was like, you can't do that. That's ridiculous, But I just had a feeling that there would be a contract with the reader that they could accept that in a way. But and then at the end, I didn't really know why the parents weren't in the book. But when I finished the book, it makes so much sense that these are women that grew up without parents in the room. And it means that they are really primed to live in the moment that we're living in. And particularly the fact, the climate aspect of the book, which isn't the whole book, but it's certainly a part of it. And that they're familiar with the stages of grief. And they know, they have this wisdom that the final stage when it comes to the climate can't be acceptance. And so then at the end of the novel, it's one of those miracles of, the subconscious. You think, of course, that's why there's this set of characters parentless. Well, so because they specifically have this, they're a step ahead, let's say, of the reader in their grief and their grappling with climate change. Is one way of thinking about it.
Yeah,
weirdly, that the novel has been received really well in Australia, and I have a sneaky suspicion that it's because of Australia's being further along, a bit like they're an equivalent of the sisters in the novel, in their thinking about it and in their talking about it.
I was trying to see it as well. In an Irish tradition, back to Jane Austen, where you can have a house, you can have a garden, you can have parkland, and then you can have thousands of acres of agricultural land that give you a fixed income. In Ireland, the first problem would be the house, because the windows would be broken. Or there would be some peasant up against the window looking in at you menacingly. And there would be no garden much. There would be some cabbages. And then parkland didn't exist in Ireland much. And no income from land was fixed. The tenants wouldn't pay, or there would be a famine. But that what you're working with then is within, to add to that, then you add this extraordinary idea of wind and rain and waves, all of it sort of menacing and coming towards you. And you're entering into a sort of Irish Gothic tradition some of the time, while using very modern, obviously, subjects, but the actual way in which there's a constant sense of encroaching. Time is encroaching, grief is encroaching, and even the actual houses they live. I mean, one of them, it's in Sutton, isn't it, that the wave is going to come in and get it. But that there is that sense of it being written out of a tradition, as well as being the next step in a sort of way of, I suppose, the novel dealing with current events.
This is great to hear. You could,
yeah, I've got to shut up in a minute and start asking more questions.
It's just to say.
I'm sorry, I've got all these things to say about
just to
your
say, it always feels weird, doesn't it, to kind of classify your own work?
Yeah, but I'm doing it for you, so
okay,
I want to know. In other words, is Dracula an Irish? I mean, what is the Irish 19th century novel? It's Mariah Edgeworth with Castle Rackrent, Dracula, Melmoth the Wanderer, Sheridan Le Fanu, all about houses that are menaced.
I think I would have been very influenced by books like The Third Policeman as well, okay. or Oscar Wilde. I suppose there's a house being menaced in a way there, but it's being menaced by the self, maybe more than anything external. I'm not going to be able to recall now the Yeats quote, but I remember reading it when I was very young, and it kind of struck me in terms of how you write that someone's quarrel should be with the world and not this. Oh no, the other way around. Your quarrel should be with the self and not the world. Yeah. And so I think that ends up being how you reorient yourself, because you really don't want to be writing nonfiction when you're writing fiction. And I think that it's all oriented around character, and really everybody's job is engaged with social mechanisms that they may or may not be kind of philosophically compatible with, whether you're working in a cafe and you're having to decide whether or not to allow overtime or to have 0-hour contracts, or whatever job you're in, you're making decisions about how you engage with the social contract, how you participate in a community, whether or not you kind of believe in you're okay with the siloing tendencies that we've all been experiencing in our lifetimes, that you can kind of live your life increasingly after COVID because of working from home, from the collapse of, workspaces and colleagues, that you can really go into holes. And in a way, that's what this novel is partly about. Is it possible to be self-sufficient? Is that anathema to being a human? And it's not a tragedy, I don't think.
This book? Oh, no, it's not a tragedy, no. It's partly not a tragedy because of what you've just mentioned, the idea of character. And I'm just going to go one more time. The way you handle character is to put someone in real time in a given moment where a lot of different sensations are occurring as though they're being etched, as though this moment, this decision, what Alwyn is actually saying to someone in her office, the paper that's being written, the food that's being cooked, the watchfulness of one of the sisters, the other one who seems so ready for the world, the crutches, the colleagues. But these are generalized terms. What I'm saying is that the way you do character is very particular. I mean, particularized. I mean, you give every moment its due. So the character comes not out of you saying things about the character. She was the sort of person who, or earlier in the day, she had, it's now, and it must be, I was going to say it must take a lot of work, but I mean, it must be a fierce amount of concentration to see what detail will I leave out? How will I put this in? So how do you work on that? I mean, how much time do you leave before you start writing? So you have all four of them firmly in your mind. So every time they come into a room, you can tell what they will do by knowing them.
Funnily enough, it doesn't feel like you're waiting to know and then you write. For me, I write without any notes, without a plan. I write completely into the dark. So it was really only in writing. When I know I'm ready to start is when I've reached peak self-loathing.
Peak self-loathing. Great. Well, here we are. Let's go.
Writers are very bad to date.
Talk to me about peak self-loathing.
In fact, I remember telling my agent about a year ago. He was like, "So, we'd had a lovely lunch," and he said, "So, what can I do for you? What can I read?" And I thought, "Oh God." I was like, "Well, I've been giving myself a very long gestational leash," and then he just he gave me a talking to, and it's
a long gestational leash.
That's a horrible mixed metaphor, but I really do believe in slow work, and I think that this will be my undoing, I'm sure, and it's career suicide. But I think the only way I've ever made anything that I've been able to stand behind or that I've thought was good was by allowing it to grow, to become a center of gravity. Because essentially, when you're making an artwork, you are wringing your soul and hoping that something comes out. And if you've recently wrung your soul, it's probably pretty dry. And so you kind of need to have that sense of you've moved on to some question. You've become a different person. So that the new artwork isn't a kind of zombie limb of the previous one. It's not an extension. It has to become so I take periods of no work in between work, but it is part of the writing. And it's very, very hard to do, to justify, but I do think so. So by the time I started with writing Alwyn, I had already, I was trying to write any other novel, something that I, would be easy, would be knowable, would be any kind of other novel. And this one occurred to me, and as soon as I locked into Alwyn and knew she was a big sister, I thought, well, a novel about sisters and they're at work. And this is the novel about women at work. Okay. I like that a novel about sisterhood and women at work can be in the same book because it sounds like two separate books. But no, let's put them in the same. And then I was like, oh God, they all have PhDs. And then I thought, well, this is just my publisher's
No, one is honorary.
So, like Sex in the City, but there's no sex and it's mostly in the country.
That's good.
So I knew I was really destroying myself with that. But anyway, it doesn't matter because it doesn't matter. Once you know, you know. Once you know there's a question here, there is a weight here, and if I don't stare it down, it'll haunt me, for the rest of my life, and I won't be able to move on. So you start it, and then it's completely into the dark. And so it's not that I know who Alwyn is, but I've waited, and she's then ready to step onto the page, and it's not a decision of where am I going to see her first? Will we see her waking up? It's no, I've seen her in a lab. And there's a student who screams outside in the hallway. And so we need to see her. How is she with these students? Do they trust her? No, they're first years. And they're wary because the things she's telling them are very unnerving. But she seems buoyant. And they laugh at her because she's very bodily. And so it's line by line. It's seeing her. It's more seeing it than it is thinking about it.
Yeah. So in other words, you have her in the lab and you need something to happen. So you go and just say you make tea and think, something has to happen now to get her out of the lab for a second. It doesn't have to be plot. In other words, whatever happens in the corridor doesn't have to appear later in the book. And you think on the way in, what if someone just screamed? Would that be a good description? Or would it, how sudden does that image come? Does it come on its own? Do you think about 5 things and think that's the one?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was really preoccupied with that as to how do I make a reader stay with her. I don't want the book to be alienating. And essentially you are getting a geology lesson, oh my God, how, and so I thought, I was really, then you're mirroring the problem that Alwyn has there teaching. How do you engage the students? How do you get them to feel this relates to you? You're telling them this is a story of billions of years, we're not even going to be an era. We might be an epoch. We might be a boundary human beings. We are so minute in geologic time. And she, at the same time, conveying to them the urgency of the fact that deep time is collapsing and that processes that should be taking millions of years are happening in decades. What does that mean? What does that mean to her when she's now teaching them in comparison to when she was learning in the very same university? Because that has changed radically. And so the writing process mirrors there the fact of the situation that she's in. And the scream, actually, I didn't plan on happening. It wasn't really thinking about it as what could I do here to create a sense of urgency. That had actually happened when I was teaching.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry, I didn't want to ask.
Yeah.
You hate asking, did that actually happen? Because most novelists go nuts because they say, well, what do you think that I'm the 4 sisters? So I didn't ask you, did you ever hear someone screaming?
No, I did. And so that was one of those things about, it's nice as you get older, you have more of these experiences in your life that suddenly, become, and it's often something that is a very tiny experience that grows and its potential in a story. It's someone that you only met for 30 seconds. And that, it's something that very well, for me, rarely makes it into novels. It's more those, and so I didn't plan on that. But then she's right in the middle and she's just about to get them to do the squeeze box experiment, compressing the thing. And someone wants to record it and they're all caught up in that. No, I want you to be in the room. I don't want you looking at a screen. And then just as she's, managing to get them to concentrate and care, even just for the aesthetics of it, then there's a scream. And so that happened, it was available to me. I didn't need to come up with it as plot. It was available to me and it arrived there. And then, of course, later when you finish the book or when you're halfway through it, you think, of course, someone is screaming and she immediately thinks that that's an appropriate response. And so, these things, that's one of the serendipities and one of the joys of writing, these moments arising.
I think just as she's trying to get the students to trust her, there's a moment where you do something. It's on the top of page 5. And it's one of those funny moments in a novel where you read something that is a tiny detail and you think, I've never noticed anyone noticing this before. Alwyn hears the clock on the wall tick forward a cluster of seconds all in one go. Those old clocks? And I would do that. I thought, wow. All in one go, like heart palpitations, harmless but horrible. And that clock appears, the clocks go right through the book. I don't know if deliberate or
I
just
didn't know
comes
this.
in. Yeah, it would be good for psychoanalysis and analysis because, there's there's a clock on. Just give me another clock. Actually, they look for clocks. There are clocks on the wall, but this doesn't happen again. This second, the next time it appears, it goes and you say every second is registered. But this.
This is so mad hearing this stuff because your brain.
But I'm saying that this sort of tiny detail gives the reader that moment where you think, I'm trusting this because this is someone noticing such tiny things that then the question of Alwyn, I suppose the question you see is that all of us were brought up to believe that people with PhDs and doctors generally are good, civilized, right-thinking people. And then you realize, actually, it's the other way around, that these people are, almost their education has messed them up further. Their knowing about Wittgenstein, their knowing about Heidegger hasn't helped them. That all four of them are that their education has made things more difficult for them.
That's an age-old thing with people who work in the earth sciences. I think it was 1949 that Aldo Leopold wrote in the San County Almanac. One of the penalties of an ecological education is to live alone in a world of wounds.
Sorry, hold on, give me that again.
One of the penalties of an ecological education is to live alone in a world of wounds. And he goes on to say something like, I won't remember the phrasing now, but you can either choose as an environmental or ecologist to harden your shell and to accept that the matters of science are something distant to you that just carry on. Or you can be like a doctor who sees all the marks of death in a community that believes itself to be well and doesn't want to be told otherwise. And he wrote that in 1949, So there is, I suppose, that sense of the curse of knowledge, definitely in that type of field.
The whole idea of water, of waves being dangerous and damaging, there's nothing timeless beauty. The concept of timeless beauty is really undermined in this book. So therefore, you need. I had a theory that I could talk to you about Charlotte Bronte and the idea of moving inland, moving into a sort of moor, into a bogland, away from the Jane Austen world, which is often very close to the sea, and this bringing you into a dangerous, dark, strange dream world where a man will come who will have strange powers. He will be a Heathcliff figure. He will have stories to tell. He will know the landscape in a way that's almost aboriginal. And but I'm not going to give up my 19th century theory.
But my sea novels are more the waves of Virginia Woolf, and then Iris Murdoch's The Sea. So there are certainly that terrain, but maybe there isn't the man.
Yeah. So I want to talk to you about Leitrim, because of course, in all of your, if you can get your characters into even a Leitrim of the imagination. There's a wonderful moment in the book. I mean, I did laugh out loud, where she's talking about fish. She's looking for some cod to put into a stew, and she says, not a stew, I know, into a pesto sauce, and says, and Dan says to her, "Oh, if you're looking for fresh fish, it's Manor Hamilton." Which I thought was great. But your Leitrim is a place of dreams. It is an ancient place. And it's a place where certain things can be resolved in a way that they don't seem to me in your novel could possibly be resolved in Dublin, in London, or in Galway. That once they enter into that space, it is a sort of dark dream space. Is that?
It's also, I suppose, pretty much landlocked. I mean, you have those precious 4 kilometers.
And they're mentioned. They're actually mentioned in the book. Those 4
kilometers, I think it is.
4 kilometres of coast called the Coast of Leitrim.
Yeah, Kevin Barry has that brilliant short story called The Coast of County Leitrim, which isn't funny to Americans, in the title, but it's funny to any Irish person who knows this about Leitrim. But it's essentially landlocked, and I had a landlocked place in the Wild Laughter as well in Roscommon. I don't know that I made any friends in Roscommon. Thanks to that book, but. And so there is something, I think, that is in the tradition, like the Irish story, the family reunion, putting you into this space. And yes, it's it's the least populated county, I think, in Ireland. So that factored in. I think then it's the county with the second highest level of people living off the grid. I think West Cork it gets the ticket there, and so
You mean off the electricity grid?
yeah, people, and so. It became, and also I was writing the book in Connemara, and a neighbour had talked to me about how he wanted to build a house in Leitrim because Leitrim is full of trees, and Connemara is stripped of trees. There used to be an endemic forest there, but there's no trees now, and there's so much weather. That's part of it. That it's the beauty of something that seems wild and dynamic, the place, but it's also in counter to that. It's also full of peat bog, which isn't moving and is very slow to accumulate, and rock, which isn't moving. So there's something redemptive in that there's that speaks of a certain resilience, that it can still be beautiful, even though with an ecological eye, it's a disaster. And I remember this one day writing the book, speaking with this guy, Jason. He talked about building this house in Leitrim, and he was flying a drone around because it was during COVID, and he normally rigs up lights for events, but all of that was done. So he was flying this drone, and there was fires all over the place. And I said, "What are you filming?" And he said, "Well, they're all burning the gorse and heather in the fields now because if you burn it every so often, it gets to count as managed land, and you get a subsidy." And that was just, I couldn't have been writing a different book to hear that anecdote. It didn't make its way into the book because you can't force these things in. But that was just, you're losing all this biological diversity and everything. So it's just an example of how much good can be done, how quickly, because the systems that we have now are so stupid. So that can be an optimistic thing. Anyway, I've completely taken you away from what you asked me about.
Yeah, because I want to come back to the idea that there's an intensity in the way the four main characters are dealt with in the book. And the intensity arises from an idea that the sisters are what they do, not necessarily are what they think. So you don't get them thinking very much. You get them doing, moving, saying. But you're putting that into it's so particular, it's so intense that you're getting a personality from a paragraph or two describing merely a swiveling chair, a small comment, a trip out to the country, a going home, that all those things are that you're working all the time trying to keep away from. She remembered that summer when the backstory is told to us in the strangest ways, that they haven't seen one another for 3.5 years, how their parents died, how the family managed after that, how the house was sold. They come in sort of darting moments. But the main thing is this extraordinary idea that if you're writing, how will you get a character by using only mainly what they do? And how do you get enough from do to get an actual sense of an entire personality?
Yeah, I was very kind of conscious that I didn't want to write, once I knew who they were, and once I had met these four sisters, I didn't want to write a book about family coming together to go over historic traumas. I didn't feel also that that this was the time for that book, and so at least where I was at, that's not what I felt. There's too much urgency. And
you mean an Irish grief novel?
Yeah, or just a family.
I don't know what an
reunion
Irish grief novel. I just thought it was a phrase, but that you have to keep away from it being merely an Irish grief novel.
Well, I don't know, merely. I was more interested in writing about these women whose the stakes of their lives are all about now. They're not about the past. And this isn't a novel about grief that's situated in the past. It's about what we're losing, which is another way of saying what's not yet lost. So they're invested in the present moment. And I kind of, giving the backstory, I wanted to do it as succinctly as possible so that it wouldn't be a novel where when they come together and find Alwyn, that they're not going to start picking at old wounds and bringing up new information that the reader doesn't really know about. They're really, it's, who's going to mind the baby while we go to the pub? Who's going to...
Good old Leo.
How do we charge this car? Yeah. And for the idea for me of women coming together and there's a blackout and someone is off the grid and someone has arrived in a Tesla. But one of them won't let her sister deplete her battery stores because who knows how long the sun is going to be gone. And so she calculates, I'll give you this much power in your car to get you out of here. How long is that going to take? And then they start doing the maths. And like that, to me, I had to cut that down. That was a way longer scene, but the publishers wouldn't let it be so long. I found that really exciting to write because it's fun, and I still feel that we have a lot of.
I mean, you really are on the side of Alwyn at certain moments. I don't know if Team Alwyn is here, but the idea that could you all just go, and that lovely moment. Yes, no, we can get your car powered to this. But that won't get me far, but it'll get you. That's wonderful. I thought that was great. And one of the things I really admire about the book, and there's a real intelligence at work, in its pages, is it's a sort of cunning intelligence to say, if I'm going to bring a man into this book at this late stage, like, here are the four sisters. Okay, Alban wants them to go. Okay, there's Leo. He's a guy, but he's only a baby. Dan comes in, and you think, oh my God, he's going to frighten them. He's going to be trouble. He's going to drink too much. No matter what he's going to do, it's going to interrupt their lives. But you make him a magical figure. You make him sometimes, he isn't just a local storyteller. He comes in with funny powers. He's almost, he ups the idea of they've entered into a dream space. He's very well made, and he's constantly intriguing. But he doesn't do the 10 things you think he could do in another sort of novel. And he's a sort of dream figure that I think is really remarkable.
Oh, thank you. I'm thinking about him after writing the book. I think he's a bit like what Doherty Black from The Wild Laughter could have been had he not had such a bullying older brother. Because maybe I get the feeling that Dan has had lots of nice women in his life.
Yes, but I'm talking about the idea of him coming in as though from a dream. He's coming in with appearing in odd places, knowing the landscape, saying that if you're going fishing, the border goes through the lake, so there's no fish on the northern side. Like, just constantly, even the phrases he uses. There's an extraordinary moment where he uses the verb to panel, which is to destroy, which I never heard before. It was panelled, meaning it was destroyed.
Yeah, well, he said. I think he says something like, Mavis, like, I can't drink that much. And he said, "Oh, did you have a rough night? Did you have a rough night last night?" Or he said, "That happened to me once with oysters. You can have 9 or 10 of them, and it's great. And then the 11th one will panel you."
Yeah, yeah. You can have 15 good ones, and then one bad one, and it panels you. It panels you. I don't think I've seen that verb used like that before. Like, help me with it.
Well, I think he just said it. He just, in writing. No,
but I mean, where did you get it?
I just from him. That's, honestly.
Take me through Spot of Bother. People remember that the first time someone said that they're meant to be from Kerry, and they realised that no one from Kerry says Spot of Bother. That there's I've got a bad Kerry accent. There's something about the O and the T that a Kerry accent, wouldn't use. Help me.
Yeah, it's the very last sentence. When that happens in the book, it's because a spot of bother. I could hear that being said, by someone, say, from Belfast, and it'd be loaded. It wouldn't just be a spot of bother, and it's not a very. It's almost sounds like quite a British phrase. It's hard to pull it off in Irish English, a
spot of bother. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
I mean, a spot of bother.
Yeah.
Oh, rather.
Which is really the Maeve sequence is about 2 languages being spoken. The Leitrim one is also about 2 languages being spoken, because it's not just Irish. There's a moment where someone says, these people in their language, meaning Leitrim, they have no way of really asking questions. It's like Mandarin has no future. Mm-hmm. You realize that you're constantly working, I suppose, with competing textures of language, that people are unable to speak to each other. But not just that. Mm-hmm. Being Irish in England, being Irish in America. And then Alwyn uses YE. She's a much more Galway-sounding person, Alwyn.
Yeah.
The others are not. The others have actually deracinated big time, haven't they?
Yeah. The Nell's English is very American now, and she'll say a couple days instead of a couple of days. Which could be wild, But if you do hear Irish people who've lived in America, like, say, Chris O'Dowd or someone like that, he can sound very Roscommon, but then he can if the phrasing, if you were actually to look at the syntax of it, has adapted to be constantly understood.
Yeah.
Because that's the big trade-off.
Yeah. Now, in James Joyce's Ulysses, he gets to a point where he just needs to do something much more, and he moves into using the language of the theatre. In other words, it's as though it's a chapter set in Nighttown, and where all the characters appear in levels of undress and unconsciousness, and it's done in dialogue. It's done as though it is a theatre script with stage directions getting increasingly funny. And it's one way of handling a moment in the novel where he just needs to break the narrative, get a new style. And he uses this system. It's not exactly a play script, but it's using the terms of a play script. So help me.
So the novel becomes a play as you've gotten past the halfway mark. At a certain point where, like I say, a play, a little bit like Circe, it's maybe a little closer to a screenplay than a stage play, in that you're able to control where the eye goes, which isn't something you can really do in a play.
Yeah, right.
And you're able to control the pace.
Yeah.
Which is
and
very
even
hard.
What characters are thinking at a certain point.
So the stage directions are a little lenient.
Yeah.
I'd be fired for submitting it as a play.
Yeah, but I think if you're putting it into a novel, you have all the license you want.
Exactly. Right. It is a novel, and it's a mode within the novel. And partly because the novel was always called The Alternatives, even though I thought it was a placeholder title, and there was a battle for it in the end because it's a very kind of forgettable title. But it allowed me to write the book, and I found that there was no other umbrella that the book would sit with under. And part of that title is thinking about alternative ways of arranging ourselves at a family level, at a community level, at a kind of social level, and alternatives to the status quo. And so that also includes alternative modes of storytelling. And I knew there were lectures in the novel. There was a Zoom in the novel. There were letters, there were emails, there were texts. And even at once there was a whole children's philosophy book. It only got boiled down into about 3 lines, but there was when Nell is kind of making this text to go around Leo's drawings, that had kind of been a book at a certain point. And that was very freeing. Also, it was terrifying because, you already have 4 sisters with PhDs and now you're putting a play in the middle of the book,
One of them is honorary.
This is true. If you ever wanted to have a readership, this is not the way to do it. But then if you think about Circe, that part of Ulysses, it is, it's so far into the book as well. It's close to the end, if I remember right.
It is, yeah.
And it's so challenging.
Yeah.
There's so many characters. You're not really being told that these are delusions or they're imaginative rabbit holes he's going down. You don't know if Bloom has taken drugs, really, or and why is all of this happening? And but I suppose if you're that far into Ulysses, you're up for whatever it's going to do. Now, I don't have that privilege of assuming that my reader is up for what I'm going to do. But I did feel that there's a certain reward in that because by then the reader knows these women. And it's a bit like knowing your in-laws. Like you've heard a lot about your in-laws for years and years and you haven't met them yet, but you know all the anecdotes. And so as soon as they start speaking, and the whole family starts speaking, you can read between the lines. You know where the tensions, you know what's not being said or where the conversation is being steered toward or, the elephants in the room. And so the reader is in on it by then. And I don't think that they needed me or any narrator to kind of interpret anything for them. Also, it would have been very difficult to decide whose point of view to privilege. It would have been a kind of roaming mic. And in this case, it really struck me as, these people are coming together. What are they going to do? Talk. Yeah. And I just need them to do that. And if I'd written it in prose, the novel would have been at least 200 pages longer, I think. So it was definitely a risk. I didn't know if there'd be a second act. I didn't know if there'd be a third. I might do a third act in 20 years' time, pull a Long Island on it.
Well, just before we go to audience questions, I just want to say that there's another thing about the book we didn't go into, but I just want to say that it's brilliantly done, the idea that they are reading Heidegger. I mean, you do believe that let me think, oh my God, Nell is literally like that. That's on her mind. She's working this out.
and the other one is Wittgenstein, and but also it's what Rona's doing in her job, and what obviously Maeve's work, and obviously all that, getting that sort of detail down so the reader can follow it, so you don't feel intimidated, is really difficult work. And I found it's one of the things in the book that I really enjoyed. Iris Murdoch could do it, Banville can do it, where you can actually follow a philosophical argument that preoccupies one of the characters in a way that suddenly can be, the word care can start preoccupying you. And so it's one of the other things I really, really admire about the book. But I don't have a question about it. I just want to say I really, really like the way you did that in the book.
Thank you.
And Caoilinn, thank you very much for doing this. It was
thank you
really
so
great
much.
talking to you.
Thank
and
you.
Thanks very much for the book.
Thank you.
And thank you.